Welcome to the International Quality Assurance Programme's webinar. I am Dr Sandi Deans. I'm a consultant clinical scientist and director of the Genomic Quality Assessment Scheme, we're also known as GenQA. I'm based here in Edinburgh in laboratory medicine in the UK, and I'm delighted to give you an overview of the international quality assurance programmes that are currently in place. I would just like to state that I have no financial relationships with commercial interests to disclose. So I'd like to start by giving you an overview of the principles of EQA, or PT as it's often called. So EQA is the external quality assessment, and proficiency testing is also known as PT. And really both of them are a summary of how we can provide an organiser outside of the laboratory's organisation themselves to be able to give a statement of the quality to the laboratory. So this is about measuring the service that the laboratory provides to their service users. So in other words, it's to provide an external assessment of the standard of service. And one very clear way of explaining this is about testing the testers. So it's about testing to ensure that the labs that are performing the testing for the clinical service is doing a good high standard service for their users. So some of the key principles are about using same samples or cases, because not all EQA schemes are wet-based schemes, to all participants, participating laboratories, clinical centres, individuals or clinicians, so a benchmarking exercise can be performed. So it's not always about assessing against performance metrics, it's often about benchmarking, so you as a laboratory director can evidence and assure your users that you're providing a high-class standard of service, but it's also comparable to other laboratories and services providing similar types of testing. What's really important is that EQA or PT is delivered in a manner that it's not linked to a particular commercial company, a testing methodology, or any other manufacturing practices. It's really important that it's an independent validation which uses a range of methods, so the actual assessment itself is testing agnostic. So that means that the samples or the cases that are supplied for the assessment have to be assured that they can provide a reportable result, the correct reportable result, for that patient, regardless of which testing methodology is used. So it's truly agnostic, because the EQA providers or the PT providers don't want a laboratory to change any of their tests or the reporting mechanisms to be able to pass the EQA itself. We want to measure the actual output of your clinical service. The other principle of EQA is about continual performance monitoring. So it's not particularly useful to participate once in a lifetime and say that demonstrates that my laboratory is working to a really high standard. You're only as good as your last EQA performance for that particular test or assay. So it's really important that the laboratory continually participates in the assessments to evidence their level of standard of testing. Also, the benefit of continual performance monitoring and continual participation is the fact that you can build up a record, so basically an evidence-based file of record of participation and also the level of performance, which not only helps you demonstrate the standard of service you're providing, but also means that there's a minimal delay in identifying issues. It's often the case when laboratories participate in different types of schemes within an EQA provider that any issue, fundamental issue within the laboratory, for example, something to do with the quality management system, training, competency, or pure sample reception, for example, sample handling issues, can be picked up when you start to look across EQA performances. And because we can pick that up in a very short timeline, it ensures patient safety, that there's no ongoing fundamental issues in the laboratory. So why should a lab participate in EQA? And laboratory directors or service users can often say, yes, they do a fantastic job, I have no concerns at all. But really, it's about having that external measurement and evidence of the standard of service that you provide. Now, that's used by many different key stakeholders to your services, and also is held in very high regard because of this external element of the assessment. It can be used by all your clinical users, and we often see not just clinical teams or hospitals that are referring to your laboratory, but also patients themselves. There's a lot of databases giving information about EQA schemes and laboratory performance that we're now finding in this era of the World Wide Web, that patients themselves can log on and will research the laboratory that's performing their testing. So it is very useful to have this external evidence that your laboratory is performing very well. We also know that many laboratories don't perform all genomic testing or a full remit of testing and use subcontracting laboratories. So if you're subcontracting your services to another centre, then it's very important that you are assured that that laboratory is performing to your acceptable standards, particularly if the results are coming back within your laboratory and they are being transcribed onto your own laboratory report or integrated with some of your own laboratory tests. So it's very common practice now for laboratories who are subcontracting services to request the evidence of participation and performance status of laboratories for those particular tests. Some genomic services are funded by central commissioners, in particular the UK and some of the other European countries, whereby there's a national health service and that there's a centrally funded pot of money that goes into the health system for tests in laboratories. And it's these commissioners who make the decision of where the tests are performed and who gets paid for that service. And again, they look to EQA results and performance measures to be able to determine which laboratory is providing the best level of service. A lot of labs also are involved in research and development partners, potentially with diagnostic companies and manufacturers of kits, etc. And again, that they are looking towards a way of selecting the laboratories, and that external quality assessment results is one way of being able to demonstrate this. Also, on a similar note, a lot of pharmaceutical companies subcontract laboratories to perform phase 1, 2 and 3 clinical trial testing, particularly in the field of companion diagnostics. And again, they look to EQA to demonstrate that the laboratory selected is to perform optimal testing for them. How do laboratories the quality? So EQA is one way of saying this. All of it is about complying with international standards, and in particular 15189 is the ISO standard for medical laboratories. And really there's an increasing requirement now for laboratories to comply with these international standards, as government and funding bodies within different countries across the world are looking at ways of ensuring high standard of patient care. What's really important as well is these standards accredit the test itself, so not the whole laboratory. So you can be assured that if you are sending a test for a specific assay in a laboratory or for a mutation test, that in itself is actually accredited. So a laboratory cannot say it's very good at clinical chemistry testing and there's some dabbling molecular testing going on in the corner. It's actually very defined about what standard is applied to which test. So again, it gives you confidence that you can evidence that you're testing to a high standard. So the ISO standard is about requirements for quality and competence, and this is something that's a real driving factor about these ISO standards. It's not just about the training and the education within the laboratory service being delivered, but it's about demonstrating that those individuals and the team is competent to perform the testing and the reporting and interpretation that is required. And it also specifies that the quality management system requirements are particular to medical laboratories. It's not a generic standard, it is very specific to medical laboratories. And all genomic testing and molecular pathology testing comes under this international standard. And as mentioned previously in my words, this is taken out of the standard itself. It can be used for confirming or recognising the competency of medical laboratories by laboratory customers, regulating authorities and accreditation bodies. It's also very important to note that part of the ISO 15189 standard is that the enrolment in a ISO 17043 accredited EQA program is an essential part of this standard. Now that means that an international standard organisation compliant with this standard is providing an EQA to a standard that can be assured that they're doing the right thing. So the EQA provider actually knows what they're doing and that they're able to give a high quality assessment, because that can have a detrimental effect if it's suboptimal on your laboratory itself. Furthermore, 17025, which is a different international standard for testing laboratories, has been reviewed since 2015 and now includes, again, participation in an ISO accredited EQA program. So I think evidence here that we've talked about 3 different ISO standards shows that this is really becoming an international wave of change of how laboratories evidence and deliver their service, and also how they can assure high quality for good patient care. Now, we all know there's many EQA providers are available for laboratories. So how on earth do you choose which one you should register with and participate through? So the first question is really, do you have a choice? Now, some accreditation bodies prefer that laboratories participate through EQAs through their own schemes. So some accreditation bodies accredit laboratories and services and also perform EQA assessment themselves. So really, there's no choice if you're going down that route, although they do state that that is not necessarily a regulation of their accreditation, but it is implied, and some laboratories believe this to be the case. However, as I've mentioned, these international standards are becoming more widespread, and really there's a requirement to evidence that the standard of assessment provided by the EQA provider itself should also be compliant with international standards. And there's ISO 17043, which is actually a general requirement for proficiency testing focused standard itself. So why would you want to comply with international standards? There's many EQA providers that were set up a long time ago, many years ago now, whereby it was just a few individuals performing sample swaps and just checking that everyone was getting the right genomic test results at the end of the day. But it's growing into a much bigger thing now, and I think that is purely because so many key stakeholders and different entities use EQA results really to be quite make huge decisions, particularly in funding or supporting research projects and clinical trials, that it's important that this measurement is actually accurate itself. International standards ensure that the EQA provider has its own quality management system, and that I'm not just talking about document control and making sure documentation is kept up to date, but really what, as an EQA provider myself, we use it to great benefit in capturing non-conforming work, and also how we look at corrective and preventative actions, not just to one EQA that we provide, but right across the board. So my scheme provides over 100 different EQA schemes annually, and we can use that identification of potential incidents or non-conforming work to actually drive the improvement of the EQA. Also, we can have clear defined objectives. Now, these can be management objectives, which is about the delivery of the EQAs internally, or it can be about scoping out new developments and pilot EQAs and really being responsive to our service users. The ISO is also very supportive of performance support. So this is not just about stating and giving labs feedback that you have a poor performance or there's an issue or you reported the incorrect genotyping result. It's more about what you do once that has been identified. Laboratories globally operate to different standards, Not all have access to very high technology, expensive NGS panel testing, for example, and some people don't even have access to arrays or fish probes, that they're still using very basic methods such as karyotyping for their mainstream routine clinical care. So it's very important that EQA providers promote good practice, promote educational elements and learning through EQA from those laboratories that are highly educated and well supported and funded to those who are also at a more minimalistic level of delivering genomic testing, because we can all learn from each other. Also, it's about consistent basis for ensuring laboratory quality. We want to make sure that two different laboratories being assessed by different EQA providers are actually benchmarked against the same standards. So we don't have a particular EQA provider that everyone thinks is a very easy EQA to pass. We want to make sure that they're all benchmarked along similar lines, and the compliance to the international standards helps us to do this. We also can deliver continual service development and improvement through the international standards, and they're very hot on pushing the fact that service development should be a continual element of delivery. And I think that's something that's incredibly important when it comes to the genomic testing and the molecular pathology testing of solid and liquid tumours, as we're in a field that is progressing so quickly that we really do have to keep up with the service is provided by the laboratories. So in other words, the EQA providers must keep up to date with what is being delivered in the labs. Also, what's incredibly important, as I've previously mentioned, is about this evidence basis of competency assessing, not just of your internal staff within the EQA providing scheme, but also the expert advisors. It's not possible for the EQA scheme delivery program to be an expert in everything that it provides. So that's why we always look to either expert international advisors who are well-renowned and have that expertise in particular assessments. So we always have the best advice and educational support for the laboratories as we possibly can. So how do you choose your EQA provider was the question that we asked. So many EQA schemes are provided from established centres of excellence. So that means that the quality of the service is consistent and continually approved. And that really is just a conclusion of a lot of the information I just covered in the previous slide. Also, it's important to have that trust and that code of conduct of an EQA provider about the reassurance of confidentiality of performance issues between the EQA provider and the laboratory itself. So there's no issues or worries about disclosure of performance to third parties, because that would just be detrimental to the service of the laboratory. And as long as performance monitoring and support is in place by the EQA provider to the lab, it will ensure that no patient harm happens. And that's really important, I think, to have that close working relationship so improvements can be made in the clinical service. And also you want to know, are they responsive to participant needs? So if new testing strategies, for example, ctDNA testing coming on board in the oncology field or in the prenatal setting, that you have an EQA in place that understands the clinical picture, understands the clinical service that you're now having to apply, and can give you access to reference materials to ensure that your test, your new test, is actually fit for purpose. This slide just gives a summary of some of the international EQA providers in the field of genetics, genomics and molecular pathology. I will state it's not an exhaustive list in any shape or form, because the more that you start looking for an EQA provider, the more that you find. You can see some providers here are fully international, such as UK NECRAS, GenQA, also CAP. And then you have other EQA providers that are more nationally based. For example, CEPA and IOM, who are based in Italy. You've got GenTish, who are based in France. You have RCPA QAP, who are the Australasian EQA provider. So there's different shapes and forms of EQA providers. Also, language can be an issue. We know that the Japanese EQA schemes are not very robust or available at the moment due to the language issue that they have problems being able to translate the reports into other languages for assessment. And you can see here on the left-hand side, the CCPI, the Chinese Committee of Pathology Industry, performs its own EQA schemes and provides them to their own Chinese-speaking laboratories. So there's lots of elements to think about when you're looking for an EQA provider. One of the benefits of being an international EQA provider is that we have different networks set up, and there's many of these globally available. Here are just 3 examples in the field of genomics and molecular testing. So we have the International Quality Network for Pathology, which is a molecular pathology and includes some cell-based pathology EQA network. And we have members of IQM Path all over Europe, the China, also Australia. We've got the Canadian EQA scheme, the Nordic QA schemes, and CAP, and other international providers as members. There's also the Eurogen test, which is more a European-based focused organisation, which is purely to do with genetic and genomic testing, so inherited disease testing rather than in somatic testing. And also more widely, a wider remit is EQAM, which is more about EQA for the full remit of laboratory medicine, of which genomics is part of. EQA Provider Networks helps in many different ways. So firstly, I would say it helps through standardization. So these networks tend to set minimum criteria by which EQA providers should operate. And this is an example of a paper in the field of molecular pathology. And it prevents what we call scheme hopping. So anecdotally, and there are some evidence available, but not published obviously, of laboratories wishing to pass EQAs, so will scheme hop between the different EQA providers if they have performance issues. So many EQA providers will monitor regularly, as I've been describing, but if you only participate in one scheme, 1 year, 6 months later you register with a different scheme, and then 6 months later you move on again, that continual monitoring will never hit the fact that there is a fundamental issue in the laboratory, unless there's minimum criteria by which all EQA providers operate to, which means that there will never be an easy badged EQA provider. So regardless of which EQA you participate through, you will still be deemed a performance issue within your laboratory if it's definitely there and it's consistently and frequently present. So that doesn't need any further explanation that it is truly for patient care. Also, it brings about opportunities for pilot EQA development and very quickly into the field of EQA provision, particularly in the field of companion diagnostics and personalised medicine, whereby new targets are recommended for testing in the clinical setting as drugs are licensed very quickly, either through the FDA or the EMA or other licensing bodies across the world. And because this can often be very expensive to set up EQA schemes for new tests coming on board, there's a real need and an advantage of having a network in place whereby funding streams can be centralised and then they can be used to help develop reference materials, validate those materials, and then distribute to as many laboratories as you possibly can. So that's a real bonus of being part of an EQA provider network. Also, we, as an EQA provider, recognise the need of best practice guidelines, or recommendations as they're now frequently called, because guidelines tend to be nationally based as by they can be applied, whereas cross-country boundary guidance hasn't got that capacity to to have some sort of regulatory element, and really they come across more as recommendations. And this is an example of one of the recommendations on behalf of IQN Path about the introduction of NGS into the clinical service. And it's much easier for EQA assessments to be able to benchmark the service of laboratories if there are peer-reviewed, accepted recommendations in place. In particular, in the field of genomic testing, we're in this environment where there's a lot of new technologies coming into play, and we can see the evolution of genomic testing. So, for example, I just pulled out some data on severe intellectual disability, and you can see the movement from FISH MLPA analysis, whereby you would detect maybe 5 to 7% of children, has increased dramatically or doubled pretty much from 10 to 15% when you use an array technology. And now we're in the world of whole exome sequencing, right through to whole genome sequencing, which is being used more and more in the clinical environment. You can see the increase and the real clinical drive and demand for different types of testing technologies. And EQA providers have to be aware of this and be able to move with the drive of the clinical service. So it's not just about new targets or biomarkers, it's also about the change in technology and the change in the limitations of the testing being performed. So it's really important that EQA providers and laboratories are aware that the assessments really should be about the end-to-end service that's being provided. It's not just about single gene test that's performed in your laboratory. So here we have right from pre-test consultation and referral in the clinical setting through to the sample that's provided and handled, the analysis itself or the genomic test, the interpretation of that data if it's appropriate, because in some countries that is not the role of the laboratory, it goes back to the clinical team, but in some countries that is very much sits firmly within the testing laboratory. Also, it's about how you report the results to avoid misinterpretation, and obviously now we're going into the world of MDT, multidisciplinary team working, which is very important when it comes to deciphering the outcomes of genomic tests, and then the consultation with the result going back to the patient. So this is a summary of the testing strategy and the end-to-end process, as you can see here. And in the middle, in the red box, this is your genotyping test. This is your analysis, your karyotype or your NGS panel. And this is fundamentally where EQA used to be focused. But now we have to move and think about the end-to-end assessment, because errors or issues at any element of the pathway is going to have an effect on the patient results being delivered at the end. So we can start at pre-test referral and consultation and work with medical clinical colleagues, whereby that they are part of the end-to-end process, because if you get an incomplete or an inappropriate referral at the beginning, that patient isn't going to get the best optimal care. Also, as I previously mentioned, the interpretation is becoming much more challenging in the field of genomics. It's not just about identifying that genomic change, that variant, it's about how does that impact on the patient and has it got an actual effect. And MDT working is very important and can take different elements, different aspects. It can take a shape of face-to-face personal meetings, that can be remote, it could be through WebEx, it could be a simple email to the referring clinician to say, we've identified this variant in a particular gene of your patient, and does this meet with the phenotype? Or it can be a quick phone call. So EQA has to start developing and looking at how they can assess the different elements of the testing end to end, and in particular interpreting the rare variants to diagnose your genetic disorders. So it's not just about the test result, it's about the individual scientific knowledge of your colleagues, of the gene structure, the function, whether it's previously been identified in the disease mechanisms, looking at different databases, etc., and using resources that are available, and being able to assess whether or not the approach is the most appropriate approach, and if not, identify where there's maybe unmet training needs. And also you need to bring in your clinical colleagues into the laboratory for that interpretation because they know the patient and the family's medical history. And a test referral into the laboratory doesn't always have all of the information required for clinically safe interpretation. So I hope I've given you an understanding of the benefits of EQA. It has a surveillance role, so this is the monitoring of the performance, which should be frequent. And laboratories, it's an assurance that they're adhering to professional guidelines or recommendations and also applying international standards, so you know that the basic level of testing in the laboratory is high. It also allows a comparison between centres against set standards, and also as educational elements through the EQA providers can help to refine good standards and define best practice. It also has an educational side whereby EQA aims to improve the overall service to the user, which again is coming back to the end-to-end processes of the testing pathway. It also helps to validate the service quality and helps to build that service user confidence. So it's not necessarily your clinical service user, but as I've mentioned, all the other key stakeholders that use the services of the laboratories. It can also not just identify any issues with testing accuracy, but gaps in internal quality management system. And often that is the case, and the root cause analysis identifies it's a training issue, it's a documentation issue, it's a process issue, whereby the patient has received the incorrect result for these reasons, not because of a fundamental issue with your test itself. And also it can identify problems with manufacturers' kits, and I think this is a real benefit of international EQA providers who perform assessments for many, many different types of countries using different kits and different testing strategies approaches. And here we can use the full set of data to identify any issues and have the one voice for the laboratory who has that communication with manufacturers or commercial companies. So the take-home message really is your EQA provider should comply with international standards, and it should also encompass the full end-to-end processes of your testing. So I would like to thank you very much for joining this recording, and I hope you found it very useful.